This is the land where Jesus lived and died. 3 days after his public execution, the body of Jesus could not be found. His grave was empty. Enemies claimed grave robbers. Friends claimed resurrection. Almost 2,000 years later, the search continues. Search for the real Jesus on this day of discovery. This is Israel, the land of the Bible and the land of Jesus. Visitors from all over the world come to see places linked to the most controversial man who ever lived. Bethlehem, the place of his birth. Nazareth, where Jesus grew up. Capernaum, the town on the Sea of Galilee, Jesus' base of operation during the 3 years of his public life. And Jerusalem, where according to the Gospel writers, he died and rose again. 20 centuries later, some call Jesus God in the flesh. Some call him a good man. Some call him an impostor, and some a political revolutionary. And some today don't even believe the real Jesus was born in the little town of Bethlehem, only 5 miles south of Jerusalem. Contrary to the claims of the Gospel writers, there are those who say the real Jesus was born in Nazareth, whether they meant to say so or not.
Hey Jim, you remember that time I made a real mistake about Bethlehem?
A mistake? You mean the time you thought you made a mistake?
No, this time I made a mistake. I really did, and it's embarrassing to this day. We happened to be at Nazareth at the time. We were talking about the life of Jesus, how he had grown up in that community, but I had inadvertently said that Jesus, who was born in Nazareth. Never realized I had said it. Got back home, got a letter from an angry viewer who accused me of departing from the record of the scriptures and accusing me of denying what the scriptures said. And I didn't do that. I didn't say that he was born in Nazareth. So I called in our editors, our producers. We went back and we looked at the tape, and sure enough, right there on tape, I said Jesus was born in Nazareth. It was a misspeak, but in saying that, I'm sure that there would have been those who would have been pleased and would have agreed with me, because there are many scholars who do not believe that Jesus was born in Bethlehem. They believe that because he's identified as the rabbi from Nazareth, or Jesus of Nazareth, that it's more likely that he was born in that community, and that along the way Christians, overenthusiastic believers, would have said that he was born here just to contrive the account of history to make it line up with the prophets of the Hebrew Scriptures. Now, when you think about it, if you're not inclined to believe in the supernatural, then you may very well look for a reason not to believe what the New Testament said about Jesus being born in this community. The fact is, there are scholars, well-credentialed men and women on both sides of the fence on this issue.
People who have always asked, who is this Jesus? And it has been very important. And people in the early church agonized over this. Was he all divine? There were people who said he was so divine that he never even had normal processes of elimination. He was only divine. Others said, no, he was a human. Other people opted for some combination thereof. Some people thought that he was divine, but not as divine as the Father.
Traditionally, Christianity has claimed that Jesus was unlike any other founder of any other world religion, in that he was truly God as well as truly human, and the unique solution to humanity's plight. Most of the modern revisions in understanding Jesus deny those central claims, so for that reason alone, the question is a very significant one.
At the beginning of the 19th century, people began to be very skeptic. I mean, could he really have performed those miracles? Did he really say these things? increasingly people began to look for the historical Jesus. Who was this person? And why in the world, just because everybody had always believed, should we believe now?
Jesus continues to be the object of a lot of popular thought and writing. And there are books, both by lay people as well as scholars, that portray him from almost every angle imaginable. Probably the most famous during the 1990s was a group called the Jesus Seminar that claimed that he did and said only a very small fraction of the things that are found in the New Testament, in the 4 Gospels.
Interestingly enough, they analyzed the sayings of Jesus, and they decided that 82% of them had not actually been said about Jesus. They also began to analyze the character of Jesus. They said that the real Jesus, not the one that the evangelists were talking about, was very passive. He never initiated, never went out of his way to heal anybody of his own accord. He always waited to be asked. Of course, we can think of the dead young man that was in the beer. We can think of the woman who was bent double. We can think of many examples. But they say, no, Jesus didn't take on his opponents. He didn't argue with them. That's all what the disciples said later. He was just a very clever guy. He gave very kind of pithy sayings. He was always sharp and snappy, and he gave people a lot to think about.
And so some modern thought comes into tension with the historical record of the Bible. The New Testament makes enormous claims for Jesus that many find difficult to accept. While there are many passages of the New Testament that describe Jesus as being more than a man, one of the more striking passages is found in the first chapter of the Apostle John's Gospel. There we read the claim that Jesus was no less than the Creator himself. John first calls Jesus the Word of creation. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him nothing was made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. Then John links Jesus, the Word of creation, to Jesus who became a man. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory, the glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. John chapter 1. With these claims of Jesus' deity and humanity, it is understandable that the Jesus of the Bible is the most controversial person in all of history. This is the city of Nazareth, where according to the Bible, it was announced to Mary that she was going to bear the Messiah. It was here in Nazareth that Jesus grew to manhood. Located in the heart of modern Nazareth is Nazareth Village, a recreation of the first century hometown of Jesus.
Well, it's an interesting story because Nazareth Village had its roots right here in Nazareth. Dr. Nachli Bishara, who is a 9th generation Nazarene and whose family has been a Christian all of that time, grew up here in Nazareth, seeing all these buses coming through and wondering what in the world are they coming here for. You know, he couldn't figure it out. I think as he grew older, he began to understand that there were spiritual reasons. And what he realized was that people were coming here celebrating the Annunciation of Jesus. And he said, wait a minute, there's something missing here. People need to come in touch with who Jesus was, what he had to teach us. And that's what really spawned the birth of this project. The desire to create a place where people could step back in time and to come in touch first face to face with the things that inspired the teachings, the parables of Jesus.
It looks as if you replicated Nazareth 2,000 years ago. Have you used actual materials that were used at that time?
Absolutely, and the first step, however, was to understand what it looked like, because there's so little that remains today from that time period. And in order to do that, we've engaged in extensive research. We've worked with the Center for the Study of Early Christianity in Jerusalem, who's made it their priority to understand these things. But they focus specifically on a number of studies for us. What did the house look like? How thick were the walls? You know, how wide were the doorways? What were the door jambs like? And the exciting thing is that their study revealed a number of dimensions for the door jambs, for the walls, and so on.
You have play actors as well that participate in the presentation here. A purpose for that?
These are, well, our goal, first of all, let me just say that we believe that by focusing on the context, the environment that shaped Jesus and his ministry, we will come not to new meanings as much as deeper understanding of what it was that Jesus had to say.
At the time of Jesus Christ, Nazareth was really a small community anyway, was it not? Only several families?
There is a debate. Some scholars believe that it may have had a population of between 1,000 and 1,500. This is based on the parameter of the town and then applying demographics of that day. There are others who believe that it was limited to maybe 100 families or so, which would have meant about 400 or 500 people.
The development of this type of a village in the city of Nazareth also gives us insight to the humanity of Jesus Christ, does it not?
Oh, absolutely. And to come to that, I mean, it's just not, it's not the result of, well, Mike Hostetler thinks this or that, but what does the Talmud say? What does the New Testament say? What do the sources like Josephus, the historical sources, say about that time? Then gradually we began to pull those pieces together and shape the day-to-day life as it would have been back then. As I look at what I've experienced here, suddenly Jesus isn't just that person I read about in the New Testament and that I hear about in sermons and so on. He actually walked this place. He had to walk up and down these hills. He must have had a strong heart. He had to relate with people. He understood their struggles and their pains and their victories. And this is then an added dimension that we can bring to our understanding of Jesus.
It was here in Nazareth for 28 years where Jesus Christ would have lived. But it was in a carpenter shop with his father Joseph. The little boy would learn. And as Dr. Luke explains in his record of the life of Jesus Christ, this man, Jesus, would develop physically, mentally, socially, and spiritually. Key to that development is most likely his father Joseph. In a carpenter shop, something similar to this.
It was here, according to the gospel writers, that Jesus, along with his brothers and sisters, were raised by their mother Mary and by his stepfather Joseph the carpenter. But it was only when Jesus began traveling, when he began his public life, that his reputation from Nazareth became a real issue. Who was this rabbi from Nazareth? Since we all know that there was a human side to him, this issue continues to the present. Is there any reason, as we look at the Jesus from history, to look for anything more than a man?
There are at least two reasons that modern scholars may be at times reluctant to consider the supernatural with respect to Jesus. One is that there are still some who believe that modern science has disproved any notion of the supernatural, and therefore, as modern enlightened people, we simply can't believe such stories. Increasingly, I think even more liberal scholars are recognizing that that's not true of modern science, but then they offer a second counter-argument, and that is that the ancient world is filled with myths and legends of people doing supernatural things, some with some parallel to the accounts of Jesus in the four Gospels, so that they believe that we should understand the original intentions of these stories to have been more mythological.
Why is it, though, that there is such division among scholars about where the search for Jesus is leading?
I think every person study of Jesus with some set of assumptions, whether they be naturalist, supernaturalist, or whatever. I think that actually what the Bible sometimes calls upon us to do is to examine our assumptions. The Bible is a challenging book because sometimes it does challenge us. And it challenges us at the very point of the way we think the story should go. And what we find when we pick up the Bible is that when we read it, we find our assumptions sometimes are challenged.
One of the more sobering things to discover in studying the history of investigation into Jesus is that with very few exceptions throughout history, people, even who come with a very scholarly and objective approach to studying Jesus, tend to find what they already believed about him or the philosophical or religious camps with which they already identified before ever coming to their more detailed research.
Some of them have actually probably come out of Christian homes growing up in their life and have rejected their Christian background and have rejected it pretty emotionally. And so it's an effort to tell the real truth about the way they grew up. I think others are sincere, and what I mean by that is that they're just naturalists or a little more naturalistic in their approach, and so they don't accept what's in the text, and so then they work to try and explain how, one, we have the text the way it expresses itself, and two, what the next best and therefore most likely explanation is.
Must one believe in Jesus simply as a matter of personal choice and faith? Are those who look for the real Jesus on a scholarly basis destined to come away with more doubts than belief? How does a scholar or anyone come to the conclusion that the real Jesus is accurately reflected for us in the gospel records?
There are today many scholars, conservative scholars, who have given themselves over to the serious study of the historical Jesus, much as the moderates and liberals have. And many of them, well, the conservative ones, are coming to conclusions that are very much in line with what we see in the biblical record in terms of explaining who Jesus is.
It doesn't make sense to reject the record of the life of Christ just because it makes claims for the supernatural. First, because increasingly modern science recognizes that it can only speak about that which is predictable and repeatable. It cannot determine whether or not there is a God. And if there is a God who is the supernatural creator of the universe, then it makes sense that he could choose at times to supernaturally intervene into our world. If you're prepared to grant that premise, then the way to investigate any claim to the supernatural is to ask how strong the historical evidence is for it, just as you would any other kind of claim that somebody made of something that had happened.
Well, the reason we need to consider more than the humanity of Jesus, as objective scholarship sometimes asks us to do, or as the media sometimes asks us to do, is because you can't understand Jesus by just understanding his humanity. I tell students that the way in which the divinity and humanity of Jesus are woven together is a little bit like a molecule. And if you try and pull it apart, what you get is a big explosion. So they're just so intertwined and so tightly intertwined. Another reason why we can't do it is if we ask why Jesus is a significant figure to history, to Western civilization in general, it's not the claims of his humanness that make him important. It's the claims to his divinity and the fact that he gave birth to an international movement that claimed to be connected to God that was important about who he was. So it is his divine humanness together that makes the story. When you take out the divinity part of it, you've ruined the story, just like if you take out the humanity part of it, you ruin the story.
Objective scholarship in discussing any human figure from the ancient world has to take into account what that person said, what they did, what we can infer explicitly or implicitly about their own claims and self-identity or understanding of their own nature. And when one does that with Jesus, one finds innumerable data to suggest that he thought he was more than an ordinary mortal, that he saw himself as a divine emissary, a representative from God, using titles and language and behavior that in the eyes of many of his Jewish contemporaries crossed a boundary bordering on ascribing to himself prerogatives that were God's alone. Whether or not one accepts those claims, it is the responsibility of a historian to investigate them and to pass some kind of verdict on them.
The reason the discussion of the historical Jesus is important is because who Jesus claims to be. Jesus does not claim to be one great religious figure located next to a whole set of other great religious figures. If we built a hall of fame of religion, we wouldn't put several rooms in it and put Jesus next to Moses, next to Buddha, next to Confucius, next to Muhammad. Jesus' claim, the claim of the record is that he is unique, that if you build this hall of fame, you might have a wing that has all those people in it, but you better have a whole section of it that's uniquely dedicated to Jesus Christ. Someone who makes that kind of a great and unique claim needs to be taken seriously, because if he's right, we're accountable to him.
I was raised myself in a very liberal Protestant denomination. I was confirmed in that denomination. I can remember my pastor explaining to us in our confirmation class about all the irreconcilable contradictions in the Gospels. My actual faith in Christ as my Lord came, unfortunately, therefore, not through that particular church tradition, but through Youth for Christ ministry in my high school. And through that, and as I continued to be nurtured by various Christian organizations in my young adult years, came to be aware of the wide range of scholarly approaches to Jesus. I discovered that there was, in fact, very good scholarship to buttress the evangelical Christian view. I also discovered even more scholarly challenges than my pastor in my confirmation class had ever posed. And I was always a good student, a bit of an intellectual, someone who took very seriously the challenge of one college professor who once said very bluntly, "You cannot be a conservative Christian and retain your intellectual integrity." I wanted to investigate that to see if it was true, but I came to the conviction that it was not true.
I came to faith in college. I was not a believer growing up. And I had a belief that Jesus was a great religious teacher who was one among many. Someone handed me a Bible, said, "Read it. We think you're a capable reader. You look to be an intelligent person. So just read it. Don't get hung up in the genealogies at the start. Don't ask me about those names. Just read the Bible, starting with Matthew, see the story of Jesus, and ask yourself this one question. Does Jesus leave the option that he's one among many, or does Jesus portray himself as unique?" I picked up the Bible, started reading in Matthew, skipped over the genealogy very quickly as I had been instructed, was very dutiful in that regard, and all of a sudden it became clear to me Jesus wasn't one among many, which had been my pre-understanding, my assumption. Jesus was claiming to be unique. I could read the record and see that. The person who built their house upon the rock was the person who listened to what Jesus had to offer, and the person who built their house upon the sand didn't pay attention to Jesus. He and his teaching became the issue. And all of a sudden I realized this book, which I had had a perception of as being one thing, actually was challenging me with quite a different message, and I was put in the position of having to take my assumptions seriously or letting them go. And it became clear the more and more I read that my assumptions about the Bible were wrong and needed adjustment. And in the process, I came to understand who Jesus really was.
Hey Jim, this is a pretty good point of view, huh? In Jerusalem?
Be careful, don't lean too far over there.
Look at that, you can see the top of the old wall where many people take a walk to circle the city. Also
from here you see the old city and the new city behind us.
And I hope our time together today has given you some fresh perspectives on what we're convinced is probably the most important subject that you could ever think about.
We've heard today from a number of people who are convinced that a search for the real Jesus will lead you to the Jesus described in the gospel accounts.
The search for Jesus is not just a matter of faith, because there's a real historical record that is there to assess. And one of the unique points of Christianity, and it shares this with Judaism, is its groundedness in history. It's there for everyone to see. Jesus went around and told his disciples as he was getting ready to face his death, I'm going to be handed over, I'm going to be condemned, I'm going to die. In 3 days, I'm going to raise up.
Then he took the 12 aside and said to them, Behold, we are going up to Jerusalem, and all things that are written by the prophets concerning the Son of Man will be accomplished. For he will be delivered to the Gentiles, and will be mocked, and insulted, and spit upon. They will scourge him, and kill him, and the third day he will rise again. Luke chapter 18.
Now we realize that in your own personal search for Jesus, you may not be ready to form any conclusions. In fact, you may find yourself confused. Certain that this man was a part of history, certain that he was a man and a good man, but not ready to conclude that he was the Son of God, a miracle worker, the Messiah. Well, if that's the case, then I'd encourage you, make sure you've gone to the original eyewitness accounts. Go to the Gospels, read it for yourself. Don't just take our opinion, don't take anybody's opinion, but read those scriptures for yourself.